listening to the Real Estate Financial Coach podcast, financial planning topics for real estate investors.
Hey everyone, I'm Dave Rowan, and I'm here on the Real Estate Financial Coach podcast. I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Scott Jensen, co-founder of Real Estate Financial Coaching. And Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Yeah, weather is great up in Minnesota where I am, and business is good and life is good.
Well, terrific. Well, we've got a full agenda today. We're going to talk about 1031 exchanges, Delaware Statutory Trusts. We're going to maybe touch base on something called a deferred sales trust, whether we like that or don't. There's some controversy there, and then maybe revert back into Delaware Statutory Trusts as maybe a better mechanism to either spread gains out or manage taxes some other way. So let's start really basic. 1031 exchange is our first topic. Scott, what is a 1031 exchange, and when does it make sense for a client to do one?
All right. The 1031 exchange, I think, is a pretty popular concept within real estate investors. I think most real estate investors have heard of it, but are maybe not aware of all of the details. And so with the 1031 exchange, you're essentially selling one property and buying another property. But in the process of selling the first property, you're not recognizing or realizing the gains and paying taxes on that. So essentially, you're kicking the tax can down the road. You're putting those gains that you've built up in your first property along to this second property. So that's the 1031 exchange. The main purpose of it is to go from one property to a larger property or even multiple properties, freeing up some of that equity that's been built up over time to speed up growth.
Okay, great. And so we know that there are a number of hard and fast timing rules. And if we miss the timing, there's no margin for error, right? What are the timing rules associated with this?
So there's two timing rules that come into play. There's the 45-day identification period, and then there's the 180-day to completion. You need to have purchased your property within 180 days. So that first one, 45 days to identify the property. And so you sell a property, and within 45 days from closing, you need to say, I'm going to purchase this property, whatever it is. And there's several different identification methods that you can use to identify properties, but that's the 45 days is very important. Then you have to close on that property or one of the properties you identified within 180 days. And it's 180 days from close. It's not 180 days from that 45-day period. That's one common misconception. The other misconception is thinking that it's 6 months. And it's not 6 months. It's exactly 180 days. Yeah. And like
And
you
what
said,
happens? Yeah, what happens if we are at day 182?
there's no longer a 1031 exchange.
And then we're paying tax.
You're paying tax. You're paying tax and you're paying the qualified intermediary their fees, which a failed 1031 exchange isn't the end of the world. It's just like you sold a property and bought another one and paid the tax along the way. But yeah, you certainly, if you go a day or two late, that's pretty painful.
Yeah. All right. So while we're on the topic of timing, I want to introduce the topic of a reverse 1031 exchange and how that can help from a timing standpoint and free up a little more flexibility in this. So talk to us a little bit about a reverse 1031 exchange and how that maybe takes the intensity down here a little bit.
Yeah, so there's three different types of exchanges. There's a simultaneous exchange. If you were to buy and sell property at the exact same time, literally just swap it, that's a simultaneous exchange. I don't know if that really ever happens in practice, or if they do, it's very rare. The most common is called the delayed exchange, or deferred exchange, rather, where you're deferring. But the reverse exchange is just the opposite, where you purchase your replacement property first, and then you've got the 45 days to identify which of your own properties you're going to sell, and then 180 days to close there. And so it's very similar from a timing standpoint, that those timelines still apply, but it's just, you do it in reverse order. To make it work, the mechanics of it are relatively complicated. There's an exchange intermediary or an exchange accommodator trust, EAT, that's created to buy the property first. It gets a little murky. But the nice thing about doing the reverse exchange is it's usually easier to sell your property than it is to buy another property. Once you've bought the property, selling your property is not all that difficult in most markets, right? But maybe if it's a really good seller's market, one type of exchange might be easier than if it's a buyer's market. And so it really depends on the environment. But in general, I'd say the reverse exchange is easier for that, but it's significantly more complicated and thus significantly more expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other kind of obvious consideration is your client can't be capital constrained. They have to be able to buy on the front end. They can't need the money from the close to facilitate the buy. So we need to make sure they have the cash, they understand the complexity, and realize it's going to be more expensive. If we've communicated all of those things as the planner, then I think it's in play as a possibility to alleviate the timing constraint a little bit.
Yeah. Yep. The other issue that comes in is just financing. Financing is more tricky. I would start with a qualified intermediary and ask them for a lender that's familiar with reverse exchanges. There's lots of lenders that just would not be good for this type of thing, and you'd end up getting your financing screwed up and potentially throwing off the entire transaction. So having a good qualified intermediary and using a lender that they recommend would be where I would start on something like that.
Qualified intermediary. This is like rolling right into another topic here associated with these. So what is a qualified intermediary? What is their role? What do they do? Why do they need to be involved? What's the story here?
Yeah, they need to be involved because the IRS says that you need one. Otherwise, you can't do a 1031 exchange. And so that's the primary, just because you have to. The IRS says you do. And so you cannot take receipt of funds from the sale of a property. If you do, there's no 1031 exchange. And so you sell the property, the funds don't go to you, they don't go to your bank account, they go into the bank account of a qualified intermediary, which is somebody that just holds on to the funds, and then they once you purchase your replacement property, the funds get sent from the qualified intermediary to the closing table to get this new property. So you never actually take receipt of the funds. And that's extremely key to this legislation. It's actually not in the 1031 regulations. It's in a tax court case where the courts just made up the procedures. But yeah, it's been going for a long time with this particular way of doing things, even though it's not actual tax law. It's just case law.
Okay. And so I don't know the answer to this one. Qualified intermediaries, can they just do this nationally? Are there any local or state considerations whatsoever, or they can be a QI anywhere across the country? Is that true?
I don't know this 100%, but my best guess would be that each state has different rules because America, right? Every state is different, sovereign in its own ways. And so each state has its own restrictions on qualified intermediaries. However, I will say that it is one industry that seems like it's somewhat non-regulated. Qualified intermediary seems to imply that there's some, like, qualified means there's some sort of certification or some sort of stamp of approval, but it's not necessarily the case. Like, it's just qualified to receive the funds. There's no, I don't think there is a lot of regulation around them. And so with that, I think you do need to be careful on who you choose as a qualified intermediary. With how I do business, there's really two things I look for. I like to have a good national brand, a qualified intermediary that works across the country. And then also about half of my clients are local in Minnesota. And there's a really good qualified intermediary who's local here that does work within town. But I like to have both as options.
Okay. Do you ever run into situations where, let's talk a little bit practice management here. Do you ever run into situations with your clients where they're not local, they're somewhere else, and they say, hey, I found this, a friend of mine used this qualified intermediary. Can you help me vet them? Do you ever get into that with people, or do you just give them a set of questions to go ask? Like, what's that dynamic for you, Scott?
Yes, I have run into it once. And luckily, the only time I ran into it, it was a legitimate qualified intermediary that was national brand. Basically, it was a wing of a title company that also had a trust division. So very large. company. It wasn't something there. I was worried that it was some sort of fly-by-night operation that was going to take the funds and run. It's nice to see if the qualified intermediary has a separate account for the funds, but not all of them do. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Now let's even back up a step further. Let's again practice management here. So you have a client, they've got some highly appreciated properties, and oh, hey, I heard of this 1031 exchange thing. I want to do one. How do you get them started? What's the process look like there? How do you coach them through
Yeah.
the process?
So interestingly enough, I think in general, clients say, like, hey, I want to sell this property and I want to do a 1031 exchange. Is typically that's how I'm approached about it. So for me, step one is, well, what are the gains and what are the tax consequences if you don't do the 1031 exchange? Because I have seen it where clients say, hey, I want to do 1031 exchange. And you go and you add up all of the improvements that were done. You add in some closing costs and realtors fees. And if we're deferring 10 grand worth of gains, the capital gains rates aren't that high, it's being not worth doing. Sell the property, go ahead, but there's no reason to do a 1031 exchange.
Yeah.
And so that's step one in my book is assess the damage if you don't do it. And then once that's been done, you can see, okay, if we don't do it, it's going to cost me 50 grand in taxes or whatever it is. All right, seems like 1031 is reasonable to do to try and avoid that taxable gain. So after that, you talk about, well, what do we want? What's the replacement property? What's the purpose of selling? Are we trying to escape some property that's, a nightmare property, or it just doesn't cash flow very well, or you're trying to change strategies? Usually your 1031, there's two things. You're either 1031ing out of to try and escape some style of management or some property, or to try and enter a different type of real estate or to gain access to another deal or something like that. Was to figure out what is this replacement property going to look like, because like we talked about, that time frame is the main consideration here. And so figuring out what the replacement property is going to be, then once you've got that figured out and maybe have a realtor helping you, potentially even identifying the property you're going to buy, at that point you'd sell the first property or but along those lines, be working with the realtor and doing everything to get the property ready to be sold.
Okay, so we mentioned some other terms in there. So replacement property, this is obviously the property that's going to be bought. And so again, talking practice management here, what kind of coaching do you give people? Do they bring properties to you and say, hey, what do you think of this? What kind of rubric do you give them in terms of things to look for in replacement properties, if any?
Yeah. So say this one is one that's very dependent on the client. I've got clients who bought, I don't know, 20, 30 properties over time, way more rental properties than I've bought and have done extremely well. Right. I'm willing to look something over if they want me to, but they're clearly a better real estate investor than I am. And so for somebody like that, I'll look at it if they want me to. Most of the time, they'll inform me of it and keep me in the loop to make sure that everything's moving along well, and communicating with the CPA and all of those sorts of things. For a new investor, I'm happy to look through properties with them. Generally, we'll take a sample of properties that they're looking at, maybe review one of them, kind of decide on what are the metrics that are important to us. Is it just a total return, very long-term play? Do we want cash flow? Is it, well, what style of real estate are we looking for? Is this short-term? Is this long-term? Is this commercial? Is this a hands-on? Is this completely hands-off, out of state? Just depends on what the client wants. But I'd say most of the time I'll look through those properties with the client before they purchase. Yeah.
Terrific. One last question, 1031. So finger in the wind, what kind of fee range do you see for a regular 1031 versus the reverse 1031? And I know, and there's also the third one that you mentioned, but what do you
Yeah.
see as that fee range in there?
Yeah, on average, it's maybe like $1,000. It depends on the property, size of the property, and of course, each company is gonna be a little different there. But I'd expect to pay somewhere around 1,000 for a normal 1031 exchange. But then for a reverse exchange, at 5, 6, 10,000, depending on the property, and it is just significantly more complicated.
Yeah. So it really has to be worth it to
Right.
to do the reverse.
But the normal one, 1,000 for a real estate transaction, is pretty darn reasonable. Yeah. But when
going
you
back to your
reverse, yeah.
going back to your case study, if we're saving 50,000, and that's not a bad surcharge to
Right.
pay for that for sure.
I do think oftentimes vocabulary is important. And we do say things like saving 50,000. Technically, we're deferring 50,000.
Yes, so
Right.
good. Such a good point.
Deferring 50,000 in taxes. Potentially we won't pay for it at all. The client won't pay for it at all if they die with the property and the step up is still around. But so far, the 1031 isn't saving taxes, it's deferring taxes.
Yeah. Okay, this is really a nice segue into Delaware Statutory Trust as a planning tool. So investors get to a point where they probably don't want to manage either as many or any properties at some stage in the game, right? And maybe they can't pass them along to kids or other things, other considerations. So let's just first talk about Delaware Statutory Trusts in terms of what it is and why a client would consider one.
Sure. In short, a Delaware Statutory Trust is a professionally managed property or groups of properties that qualifies as a replacement property in a 1031 exchange. It's the only type, not the only type, the only major type of commercial real estate, like professionally managed, 100% passive real estate that you can use as a 1031 or in a 1031 exchange for replacement property. That's the big deal about it.
So why would a client want to do this?
If you've managed real estate, which I have,
And you
it's
have. I just heard
yeah.
about your massive improvement to your Airbnb or VRBO or wherever you are with that thing. That was mind blowing what you did.
Well,
We don't have time for you to show pictures, Scott. It's amazing. Go ahead.
yeah. At the same time as that, the basement in a long-term rental I have flooded. The water softener exploded. Never heard
So
of
there's
that
always
in my life, right? But the water softener, the tank that holds all those little beads, if you know what's in the
I
water
know
softener,
my parents have one. Yeah.
those beads were everywhere in the basement, and there was about 3 inches of water there. And paying to get that remediated, cleaned up, dealing with the insurance company, redoing it, trying to keep the tenants happy. There's lots of reasons to want to get out of real estate. And anyone who's been a long-term landlord knows it's not passive. The IRS is the only way you can deduct real passive income. It's good
Okay.
income. I like it. We're both investors, but there is work and there's responsibility and there's stress that comes with it. And escaping that is what makes DSTs worth doing, I think. It's certainly what makes them attractive.
Good. Help clients choose where to park their
Yeah.
money. Right. How do we vet these people?
So DSTs have been around for a little while now, like over 10 years, but prior to that, prior to '08, they were pretty small. DSTs were getting popular like in the early, well, say 20 years ago, and then they got real popular, and then 2008 hit, and then they really took a nosedive, and then they've been gaining popularity a lot over the past 10 years again. But with that, after 2008, most of the sponsors have shut down. And so there really wasn't that many. But over the last 10 years, just each and every year, there's more and more sponsors that are bringing DST offerings to the market. And so helping clients find a DST that fits their needs is a bit of an art and a science because really it depends on what the client needs and what the client looking for. Um, and so I start out by saying, okay, what are we trying to put in your portfolio? Are we trying to diversify? If you're all single family homes, let's not do a single family home DST. Let's maybe do it.
So simple, but such power, really,
Right.
from a diversification standpoint.
Yeah. You've got a portfolio of single family homes in Florida. Let's do self storage in Iowa. Way different market. Let's do student housing in Nebraska. Way different than what you've currently got. And so usually we try and get some diversification like that. And that's just looking at what's the opposite of what you currently have. And so oftentimes that's a consideration. And then once you've decided on, okay, here's what we want to put in your real estate portfolio, from there we can find sponsors that are credible and have offerings that match what we're looking for. There's several sponsors that usually have a few offerings available, but there's tons of sponsors that are smaller that maybe have one or two offerings a year, or some of them are just new and they're just getting into the DST space. For my clients, for the most part, I stay away from anybody that's new.
Me too.
Uh, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Let's make sure we had some got kicked around a little bit by a couple of markets that went sideways. And
right,
yeah,
right,
absolutely.
yeah. Somebody's got to try it, right? Somebody's got to try these guys out, but they don't have to be my clients.
How
Well,
about
that's fun.
specific sectors? You mentioned storage, self storage. You mentioned there's
Yeah.
DSTs for everything. Any sectors that's just this is not appropriate. I really don't like this as a space.
The only one that I'm uncomfortable with because it doesn't fit the overall structure that a DST usually fits in is land. There are some land DSTs. It's not what DSTs were made for. It's really a poor fit, I think, for sort of the legal constraints that DSTs have to follow. So I don't like land in general for this. Most everything else, though, DSTs is just a type of ownership that has these regulations put onto it, additional constraints. So you can do most any type of real estate within a DST.
Okay, terrific. And so I think you're an e-money guy. I'm a right capital guy. When we're in there for planning purposes, what should we be putting in for return assumptions on these kinds of things?
Yeah, and so that's a tricky part because past results do not predict future performance. The market now is way different than the market was a few years ago because interest rates, it's a completely different market. So I with DSTs, they put the cash flow on there, right? And I usually stick the cash flow in there as they mark, as it says in the offering, as the sponsor advertises. But that's the yield that's separate than growth. Growth, I'm generally pretty conservative with these. I just put 4 or 5% and leave it at that. Yeah, you're gonna get, yeah, like a little better than inflation is what I would look for in one of these. It's not a growth vehicle at all. It is an income vehicle, and it's just waiting around to get your step up in basis.
That's the play. That's the
Yeah.
play. If you have millions of dollars in appreciated property value, it's a very smart one, really.
It really is. And cash flows have taken a hit with interest rates rising. But if you look at, especially properties that somebody's owned for a long time, they've built up a lot of equity in, especially if the mortgage isn't paid off. But even if the mortgage is paid off and they're not getting a depreciation benefit anymore, that's been all used up. Really, the cash flow DSDs put off oftentimes is at least as good as what the client's getting as far as cash flows from their properties anyway. I've seen it several times where that's been the case. So similar cash flow, no work to run it. You just put it in the DST and let it run its course, and then you can decide whether you want to do another one or not.
Scott, I think that's so powerful because our job as planners is not only to help people make good decisions, but also help them feel good about the decisions that they're making. And so what you said about, hey, the cash flow on this thing's basically the same. It's not as glamorous, right? You're not out there managing this thing and getting that reward, but you want to move on anyway. And the math is pretty much the same. We're just changing how it comes to you. So that's really a nice way to encapsulate this whole thing for people.
Yeah, and I think it's like the benefit is that it's passive. You no longer have the stress of managing real estate. If something goes wrong, they have to deal with it. You can sit on the beach, do whatever you do as the owner, just collecting income. Um, the downside is probably your growth is going to be less than it would if you were take a real active role in real estate. So that's what I think of as the trade-off. And most of the time, generally older folks are who these are for. Most of the time, folks are happy to take that trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Wow, we could talk about this stuff for hours. We got one more topic to cover, kind of controversial, and it is the topic and which I'm really just learning about myself, which is a deferred sales trust. You and I talked a little bit before we started recording here about the notion of maybe we have clients that are really heavily concentrated in real estate and maybe are a little worried about parking with this developer they don't really know. But boy, I don't want to pay these capital gains. So what can I do? And up pops a possibility, which is the deferred sales trust. And so what is it? And does it pass the sniff test for the IRS? Is the questions here.
Yeah, and this is debated. This is debated. Of course, the folks selling them say, Yes, yeah, of course, this is legal is on the up and up. It passes all of the sniff tests, all of the rest. So deferred sales trust is the type of monetized installment sale. Basically, it's an installment sale, but you get the ownership of the note that gives you the installments immediately. And in my view, that this is not an actual legal transaction, but I don't know of ones that have been challenged by the IRS yet. But
Yeah,
it
it's such an
has,
operative word. Yet is right.
yeah, and it's not an area that I'd be willing to mess with right now, with especially in light of current IRS funding, things like that. But if you look up monetized installment sale, it hits the IRS's dirty dozen list of things that they've red flagged for audits, and that they will be going after in the future. And there's several areas that it just doesn't pass the smell test. So you could say step transaction doctrine, it violates that. Other areas, you wouldn't think it's a bona fide. The intermediary doesn't really do anything in this. The, like, prove there's some sort of business sense to have the intermediary involved. There's not any legitimate business transaction there. It's essentially a sham transaction in order to spread out the gain. And usually how they have these set up is that the installment sales, it's long-term installment sales all set up as interest, and you never actually get the principal until the end of this thing, however many years in the future. Yeah. So to me, it doesn't pass muster, but I can't give you any good examples of
Well,
where the IRS has come down
it-
hard on it.
yeah, and but you said something really key here, which is okay. Again, we're not avoiding this altogether. We're just spreading out these taxes. Let's revert back to Delaware Statutory Trust. You can set that up to cascade out how you're realizing gains, right? So why don't you talk us through an example of how a client might structure multiple Delaware statutory trusts to do the same thing, but within a
Yeah.
vehicle that's recognized by the IRS?
Yeah, and so I think it's probably it takes a little bit more work, but I don't know. Deferred sales trusts, they're complicated and super expensive. Whereas you can take in a 1031 exchange, you can 1031 into multiple properties. You can also take cash out of an exchange that's taxable. If you are thoughtful and strategic in your planning, you can recognize gains, not gains from the entire property all at once, but let's say you sell a property 1 year and you put it into 3 different DSTs. Also, that year of sale, let's say you take $100,000 out of the 1031 exchange, pay taxes on that 100,000 at the preferred long-term capital gains rates, the preferential rates. With those 3 DSTs, try and structure in such a way that the term is different within the 3, so that they should mature at 3 different times, right? And spreading your gains out over multiple years. And then with that, you can decide to 1031 some or all of those gains as they mature, and do it again if you want, just depending on what the tax situation and income situation is. But I think if you're thoughtful and strategic with the planning, you can spread the tax out over multiple years with DSTs, Delaware Statutory Trust, as opposed to deferred sales trusts, with real estate anyway, and avoid, I think, some of the gray area and the costs involved they're very spendy deferred sales.
Oh, it's expensive on the front end and they're expensive to maintain from what I understand. These things
Sure.
tend to be fee factories for sure.
Yeah.
Scott, I think we're out of time here. This has been tremendous for me. I hope it's been great for our viewers here. So thank you for taking the time today to talk us through 1031 exchanges, Delaware statutory trusts, and obviously please dial into the community if you have additional questions following up from this episode, and we are happy to answer them. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Dave. It was good to talk to you. Fun conversation.
Sure was. All right, everyone, we're signing off. Take care.